The war had lasted 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Nobody on Earth had expected it to last that long. When the first Vel'Korath ships appeared at the edge of the solar system, dark and enormous against the stars, most governments assumed it would be over in weeks. Either the aliens would destroy humanity quickly, or humanity would find some way to make them leave. Nobody planned for a slow, grinding war that chewed through fleets and soldiers and resources and left both sides exhausted without a clear winner. The Vel'Korath were old. Their empire stretched across 40 star systems. They had been conquering species since before humans had learned to write. They had weapons that could crack moons and ships that moved through space like schools of black fish. By every measurement that existed, they should have crushed Earth inside of a month. But they hadn't. Nobody could fully explain why. Some generals said it was geography, that fighting at the edge of their empire stretched Vel'Korath supply lines thin. Some scientists said it was biology, that humans healed faster than expected and adapted to battlefield conditions in ways that confused Vel'Korath commanders. Some ordinary people, the kind who sat in small apartments watching news feeds with cold cups of coffee in their hands, said it was something simpler. They said humans were just too stubborn to die properly. Whatever the reason, 3 years passed and Earth was still there. Then the Vel'Korath sent a message. It was short and delivered in surprisingly good English. It said that the Dominion of Vel'Korath was willing to open negotiations with the human species, and that as per Vel'Korath tradition, the negotiator sent by humanity must be a soldier currently active in combat service. Not a politician, not a diplomat, a soldier. Earth's military council spent 2 weeks debating who to send. They considered generals with long records and impressive uniforms. They considered decorated officers who had won famous battles. They considered people who were smart and calm and trained in negotiation. Each name they proposed was sent to the Vel'Korath for approval, and each name came back rejected without explanation. After 14 rejections, someone suggested a lottery. It was supposed to be a joke. It was not received as a joke. Within 48 hours, a list of 4,000 active combat veterans was compiled, and a name was drawn. Staff Sergeant Elias Cord received the news on a Tuesday morning while eating instant noodles in a barracks cafeteria on a military base in what used to be northern Finland. He read the message twice. Then he finished his noodles. Then he read the message a third time. He was 34 years old. He had served in 3 different combat theaters during the war. He had no medals for brilliance or heroism, only the standard service ribbons that came from showing up and surviving. His commanding officer had once written in an evaluation that Cord was unremarkable in almost every way but extremely difficult to rattle. It was not meant as a compliment. Cord had never minded. He was not chosen because he was the best. He was not chosen because he was clever or well-spoken or impressive. He was chosen because a machine pulled his name from a list, and because the Vel'Korath, for reasons no one on Earth fully understood, accepted him. He was given 1 week of briefings. Analysts explained the Vel'Korath Empire in great detail, its structure, its history, its culture, its military capabilities, and its political systems. Cord sat through all of it quietly. He asked few questions. He took notes on paper rather than a datapad, which the analysts found strange. When they asked him why, he said he remembered things better when he wrote them by hand. They didn't argue. He was given a single escort ship, small, unarmed, painted white as a signal of non-aggression. He was given a formal uniform that he wore once, decided it was uncomfortable, and then wore his standard service jacket over it for the rest of the journey. He was given a communication team, a medical officer, and 2 other soldiers as support staff. He was given a datapad loaded with information. He was also given a speech written by Earth's council that he was supposed to deliver. He read it 3 times on the journey. It was full of strong language about human dignity and the rights of sovereign species and the importance of mutual respect. It was the kind of speech that sounded very good when read in a conference room on Earth. He put the speech in a drawer and did not look at it again. The journey to Velcarath Prime took 9 days. Cord spent most of it reading everything the analysts had given him and sleeping. His support team expected him to be nervous. He didn't seem nervous. He seemed like a man on a long bus ride who had accepted that the ride would end when it ended. On the 4th day, his medical officer knocked on his cabin door and asked if he was all right. Cord said yes. The medical officer stood in the doorway looking uncertain and said that it was okay to be scared. Cord looked at him for a moment and said that he was scared every single day, and that being scared was fine as long as it didn't stop you from doing the thing you were supposed to do. The medical officer went back to his own cabin and thought about that for a long time. On the 9th day, Velcarath Prime appeared on the navigation screens. Even from a distance it was massive, a dark planet with deep violet clouds and cities that glittered faintly across the night side like scattered embers. It was surrounded by ships, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were arranged in a pattern that was almost beautiful and was clearly also meant to be terrifying. Cord looked at the screens for a while. Then he asked his navigator how long until they were brought into dock. 4 hours, the navigator said. Cord nodded. He asked if anyone wanted to play cards. Nobody took him up on it. When their small ship was guided into the docking bay of the Velcarath station orbiting the planet, Cord looked out the porthole and watched the alien ships move around them. They were enormous and dark, and moved with a smooth, deliberate slowness that made everything around them feel small. He could feel the size of the empire they represented, thousands of years of conquest and control, folded into metal and light. He picked up his datapad. He picked up his dog tag from the small shelf above his bunk and put it in his jacket pocket. He had worn it through 3 combat deployments, and he saw no reason to change that now. The docking clamps engaged with a deep, heavy sound that moved through the floor of the ship. Cord stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the exit ramp. His support team fell in behind him. None of them spoke. The ramp lowered slowly, and cold alien air moved into the ship, thin and sharp, with a smell like metal left in the rain. At the bottom of the ramp stood 12 Velcarath soldiers in dark armor. They were tall, each one nearly 7 feet, with gray-blue skin and eyes that were flat and still like stones underwater. They did not speak. They simply turned and began walking, expecting to be followed. Cord followed them. He did not look back at the ship. He walked into the empire that had tried to destroy his world with the same expression he had worn in the cafeteria that Tuesday morning. Quiet, steady, and very difficult to rattle. Somewhere above him, through the metal and the atmosphere and the vast dark distance, Earth was still there. That was enough. The throne hall was built inside a hollowed moon. That was the first thing Cord understood when they brought him through the outer gates, that the structure he was walking into was not a building in any normal sense. It had once been a natural satellite of Velcarath Prime, small and gray and unremarkable, and at some point in the ancient past, the Velcarath had carved it out from the inside. They had turned the stone and the dark into a chamber so large that the ceiling was invisible. There was no ceiling. There was only shadow above, deep and total, with faint lights scattered through it like artificial stars. The floor was polished black stone that reflected everything like still water. The walls were lined with bones. Not scattered bones, not piled bones. These were arranged carefully, deliberately, with something that might have been artistry if it had not been so cold. Skulls of dozens of different species were mounted in neat rows at eye level, each one labeled in Velcarath script. Some were large, some were small. Some had shapes that suggested faces nothing like a human face. All of them were clean and pale under the dim light. Cord looked at them as he walked. He did not look away. He counted them the way he had been trained to count threats in a room. And he stopped counting when he reached 200, because the rows continued further than he could see. The walk to the throne was a 1/4 mile long. He had been told this in the briefings. What the briefings had not fully captured was the experience of actually walking it. The hall was designed to make the walk feel endless. The scale of everything around him, the height, the width, the rows of bones, the other beings standing silently along the edges of the path, pressed down on a person in a way that was not quite sound and not quite weight, but felt like both. Along both sides of the path stood the representatives of other species. Some were Velkarath citizens. Some were ambassadors from tributary world species that had been conquered and were now allowed to exist under Dominion rule as long as they were useful. They wore formal clothes and stood very still. Some of them watched Cord with curiosity. Some watched with something that might have been pity. None of them smiled. Cord walked at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. The 12 soldiers who had escorted him from the docking bay peeled away at the entrance to the hall. He was alone now. One human in a service jacket that was slightly too worn for the occasion, carrying a datapad, walking across black stone toward the far end of a room carved from a moon. He could see the throne eventually. It came out of the dark gradually, the way a shape becomes clear when your eyes adjust, first a suggestion of something massive, then an outline, then detail. It was made of dark metal and some material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It sat on a raised platform at the end of the long path, 7 steps above the floor. And on it sat the queen. Serevith the Undying was 10,000 years old, though she looked like something outside of age entirely. She was tall, even-seated, 8 feet of pale gray flesh and Shadowtech armor that moved around her like a living thing, rippling softly at her edges and pulling the light away from her so that she seemed to exist in her own permanent shade. Her eyes were gold and very still. Her face was long and precise, with features that had been beautiful once and were now something beyond beautiful, something that had passed through beauty and come out the other side into something harder and colder and more permanent. She was watching him before he finished the walk. He stopped at the base of the platform steps. He did not bow. The briefings had discussed bowing. Cord had decided that he would not bow, not because he was trying to make a point, but because he had been told that no amount of bowing had ever saved the species whose skulls were on the walls, and he saw no reason to start a tradition that wasn't working. He stood and waited. Serevith said nothing. The court said nothing. An hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. Cord stood. He did not shift his weight dramatically. He did not sigh loudly. He breathed slowly and looked at a point roughly level with the queen's shoulder, which was a technique soldiers used when they needed to stay calm without making direct eye contact for long periods. His feet hurt by the second hour. He had a pain in his lower back that he had carried since a combat injury 2 years earlier. He ignored both. After 6 hours, Serevith spoke. She spoke in English. Perfect English, with no accent, no hesitation, the English of someone who had learned it completely and recently, and who wanted him to know that she had made the effort specifically so that he would miss nothing that followed. She told him that humanity was young. She said this the way someone might describe a fruit that hadn't ripened yet, not with anger, but with a kind of detached observation that was somehow more cutting than anger. She spoke about the human lifespan, which she called brief to the point of being meaningless in any cosmic scale. She described human biology as fragile, inefficient, and poorly designed. She referenced specific battles from the 3-year war and described Earth's tactical decisions with the tone of a teacher correcting a child's homework, patient, slightly tired, and thoroughly unimpressed. She called human emotional responses irrational. She called human technology primitive. She referenced the total number of ships Earth had lost in the war and compared it to the Velkarath losses, which she presented with obvious satisfaction. She spoke about what humanity might have become if it had been given another 5,000 years of development. Almost kind, that part, the way a eulogy is kind. She offered Earth a choice. Submit willingly to Dominion authority. Become a client species. surrender military autonomy, accept Velkarath governance, and in exchange, receive the protection of the Empire and the right to continue existing in a reduced form under supervision. Or be removed. She said removed, the way people say words when they have used them many times before and feel no particular weight in them anymore. The court laughed throughout. It was a large sound, layered, coming from hundreds of beings along the edges of the hall, and it rose and fell in response to the Queen's words like an instrument she was playing. Some of it was genuine amusement. Some of it was political performance, the laughter of beings who understood that laughing when the Queen was entertaining was a form of survival. Serevith finished. She leaned back slightly in the throne. Her gold eyes were on chord with the patient, faintly curious expression of someone who had seen many reactions to this speech and was mildly interested to see which variety this one would produce. The hall was quiet. Cord stood at the base of the steps and said nothing for a moment, not from shock, not from fear. He was organizing his thoughts in the same way he organized his notes, slowly, by hand, without rushing. Then he looked up at her directly. "I'd like to ask you 3 questions before I respond, Your Majesty," he said. His voice was not loud. It was very calm and slightly rough, the voice of someone who spent more time outdoors than in meeting rooms. It carried in the silence well enough. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. It stopped all at once as if something had cut it. Nobody asked the Queen questions. In 10,000 years of receiving ambassadors, no one had responded to that speech with a request for questions. The court did not know what to do with the silence that followed, so they stayed inside it and waited. Serevith looked at the human for a long moment. Her expression did not change, but something behind her gold eyes shifted, something small and old, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. "Ask," she said. The word landed in the hall like a stone, dropped into still water. "Ask." Cord had expected many possible responses. A refusal, laughter, an order to leave. He had not been certain she would agree, and he had prepared himself for the possibility that she wouldn't. But she had said it simply and without performance, and now the hall was waiting, and he had to speak. He took a breath, not a dramatic breath, just the ordinary breath of a man steadying himself before something difficult. He looked up at Serevith and asked his first question. "How many of the species whose skulls are on these walls came to you in peace first?" He did not gesture at the walls. He did not need to. Everyone in the hall knew exactly what walls he meant. The bones had been there for centuries. They were so familiar to the court that most days nobody looked at them anymore. They were simply part of the room, like the floor and the dark ceiling and the cold air. But now people looked. Heads turned slowly along the edges of the hall. Eyes moved to the rows of skulls, the careful, labeled, deliberate rows that stretched back into the dark on both sides of the long path. The representatives of tributary species looked. The Velkarath military commanders looked. Even some of the Queen's advisors, standing nearest to the throne, turned their heads slightly toward the walls. The silence stretched. Serevith did not answer immediately. She was watching Cord with her gold eyes, and her expression had shifted into something that was harder to read than the cold amusement from before. She knew the answer. Everyone in the hall knew the answer, because it was history, recorded and taught in every Velkarath school and military academy for 10,000 years. Every species on those walls had sent ambassadors first, every single one. It was not something the Velkarath were ashamed of, exactly. In their culture, it was not considered a contradiction. A species could approach in peace and still be conquered if conquest was the logical outcome. They did not see those initial meetings as a betrayal of trust. They saw them as data collection. The ambassadors came, and the Velkarath learned what they needed to learn, and then they acted. But the question had put that history in the room in a way it had not been in a very long time. The bones on the walls were trophies. They were symbols of power. They were not usually thought of as a pattern. "Ask your second question," Saravath said. Her voice was even. She was not going to answer the first one out loud, and they both understood that, and Cord accepted it without pushing. He asked his second question. "Of your 40 conquered systems, how many still produce at the same output they did before conquest?" This one moved differently through the room. The first question had been historical, something that touched on the past and on memory. This question touched money. It touched resources and logistics and the practical functioning of an empire. The Velkarath had economists in their court. They had trade ministers and resource administrators and military supply commanders, and every one of them understood immediately what the question was pointing at. The answer was not 40, it was not 30, it was not even 20. 3 systems, out of 40, currently produced at or above their pre-conquest levels. The rest had declined. Some had declined slightly. Some had declined sharply. There were entire systems that had been rich in resources before the Velkarath arrived and were now producing a fraction of what they once had, because conquest changed the conditions that had made production possible. It disrupted infrastructure, displaced skilled populations, replaced local expertise with Velkarath administration that understood control, but not always the specific knowledge needed to keep complex systems running. It was a known problem. There were internal reports about it. Long, detailed, carefully written reports that sat in administrative archives and were read by the economists and occasionally summarized for the advisors, and almost never reached the Queen because the Queen did not typically wish to hear about economic underperformance. Nobody said the number out loud, but several people in the hall were now looking at their feet or at the middle distance, which was its own kind of answer. Saravath's eyes had not moved from Cord. "Your third question," she said. Cord asked it. "How long has it been since anyone in this room told you something you didn't want to hear?" The hall did not make a sound. Not the held-breath silence from before, which had been surprise. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of a large group of beings who had been asked a question that reached inside them and found something uncomfortable, and who were now very carefully not looking at each other, and very carefully not looking at the Queen, and trying to appear as though they were simply waiting for what came next rather than sitting with an answer they already knew. Cord looked around the room slowly. He was not trying to be theatrical. He was genuinely looking, reading the room the way soldiers read environments, gathering information from small details. The advisors near the throne had gone very still. The military commanders along the left wall were holding themselves with a particular rigid posture that he recognized from his own service. The posture of people in a room where the person in charge had said something that made everyone afraid to react. The tributary ambassadors were different. Some of them were looking at him with expressions he couldn't fully read, complex expressions that involved more than one emotion at once. He thought he recognized something in a few of those faces, not quite hope, something quieter than hope, something like recognition. He reached down and placed his datapad on the floor. He set it at the base of the platform steps, not as an offering placed at a shrine, but the way you put something down when your hands are full and you need to set it somewhere practical. Flat, unremarkable, just a datapad on black stone. "That contains everything we've learned about your empire in 3 years," he said. "Military infrastructure, trade bottlenecks, succession vulnerabilities, the internal faction divisions in your 7 border systems, the real production numbers from the conquered territories, not the reported ones, the supply chain gaps in your northern fleet corridors." He straightened up. "It's not a threat. We're not holding it over you, and we're not using it as leverage. Every piece of intelligence on that pad has already been shared with Earth's full council, so keeping it from you costs us nothing. We're giving it to you because a sick empire makes a bad neighbor, and we would rather live next to something stable than watch 40 systems slowly collapse on our border." He paused. Humans do that when we're frightened. We research, we read, we take notes, and we learn everything we can about the thing that scares us. I don't know if that makes us strange to you. It's just what we do." He looked at her directly then, properly, not at her shoulder but at her gold eyes, and he said the last part. "You can conquer us. You have more ships and more resources and 10,000 years of experience doing exactly that. But I want you to understand something before you decide. We are the only species in this room that will still be arguing with you 1,000 years from now. Not because we're powerful, not because we're clever, because we do not have any way of stopping ourselves. We have tried. It doesn't work. We just keep going." He picked up nothing. He turned nothing over. He left the datapad where it was. Then Sarevith laughed. It was a real laugh, not the performed, layered sound the court had produced earlier, but something genuine and sudden that came from a place that had not been used in a long time. It rose up out of her like something unexpected even to herself, and it was almost warm, and then it became something else, something sharp and bright that she aimed at him like a weapon. "Look at it," she said to the court, and her voice was full of amused contempt. "The little soldier thinks stubbornness is a superpower." The court laughed, relieved laughter, the kind that comes when people have been holding tension and someone gives them permission to release it. Cord listened to all of it. He nodded once, a single small nod, the kind that means understood rather than agreed, and then he turned around. He began walking back. The full quarter-mile, the same polished black floor, the same rows of bones on both sides, the same distant exit tiny in the dark. He walked at the same pace he had used coming in, not fast, not slow, just steady. His back was still hurting. His feet were worse than before. He kept his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the far doors, and he did not look at the walls and he did not look behind him. The laughter followed him for a while. Then it began to thin. By the time he was halfway to the doors, the hall had gone quiet again, not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of a large group of beings sitting with thoughts they had not expected to be sitting with. The datapad was still on the floor at the base of the steps. Nobody had picked it up. Cord reached the doors. He walked through them without stopping. Behind him, in the throne hall carved from a moon, Sarevith the Undying sat very still on her ancient throne and looked at the small flat rectangle of a datapad sitting on the floor of her court, and said nothing at all for a very long time. The datapad sat on the floor of the throne hall for 6 hours before anyone touched it. Not because no one was allowed to. Sarevith had not given any order about it either way. It simply sat there on the black stone at the base of the platform steps, small and flat and ordinary, and nobody in the court quite wanted to be the first one to walk over and pick it up. There was something about it that made people careful. It was not a weapon. It did not look dangerous. But it had been placed there by a human soldier who had walked out of the hall without bowing, and something about that combination made the court treat the object as if it might be more complicated than it appeared. Eventually, one of Sarevith's senior advisors, a tall Velkarath named Orvith who had served in the court for 3 centuries, walked over and picked it up. He carried it to a side chamber and connected it to a secure analysis system and began reading. He read for 4 hours without stopping. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the wall for a long time. Then he called 2 other advisors into the room and showed them what was on the datapad, and they read it too. And when they were finished, the 3 of them sat together in the side chamber and nobody spoke for a while. The information was accurate. That was the thing that kept stopping them. It would have been easier if it had been propaganda, carefully selected facts arranged to mislead, the kind of intelligence package an enemy puts together to create a false picture. They had seen that before, many times. They knew how to identify it and discount it. This was not that. The humans had compiled a clear, honest, and deeply detailed portrait of the Velkarath Dominion as it actually existed, not as it was officially recorded, not as it was presented in public documents and imperial histories, but as it functioned on a practical level from day to day. The production numbers were real. The supply chain gaps were real. The faction maps were real. And those were the most troubling part, because whoever had drawn them understood the internal politics of the Dominion better than some of the people who lived inside it. There was a section on the succession question that Orvith read 3 times. It described the current tensions between 4 major Velkarath noble houses with a clarity and accuracy that should not have been possible from the outside. It named individuals. It described relationships and rivalries. It outlined 2 specific scenarios in which the tension between those houses could escalate into open conflict, and it did so without drama or exaggeration, the way an engineer describes a structural weakness. Here is the point, here is the pressure, here is what happens if both increase at the same time. At the bottom of the succession section, there was a note. It was short. It said, "We are not sharing this to threaten you. We are sharing it because instability in your succession creates unpredictable conditions on our border, and we prefer predictable neighbors. Fix it or don't. That is your business. We thought you should have the full picture." Orvith stared at that note for a long time. He had spent 3 centuries in the court of Saravath the Undying. He had seen hundreds of species send ambassadors. He had watched negotiations that were sophisticated and negotiations that were desperate and negotiations that were simply performances put on by beings who had already accepted their fate and were trying to maintain dignity while it arrived. He had never seen anything like this. The datapad's contents moved through the court the way water moves through dry ground quickly and further than expected. By the 2nd day, most of Saravath's senior advisors had read it. By the 3rd day, copies had been made and the information had reached the military commanders. By the 4th day, it had spread further than anyone had intended, and 3 things happened that nobody had predicted. The first thing was that the 4 noble houses named in the succession section became aware that their internal tensions had been documented and shared. The effect of this was not to make them cautious. The effect was to make each house assume that the others had been the source of the leak, that a rival house had somehow communicated this information to the humans and used them as a channel to expose it publicly. This assumption was wrong, but it felt logical, and the tension between the houses increased sharply. The second thing was that the tributary ambassadors got hold of the production data. The real production data. The actual numbers from their own home systems, which their Velkarath administrators had been reporting inaccurately to both the Dominion and to the tributary governments themselves. Several of these species had believed, based on official reports, that their worlds were producing near their pre-conquest levels. The datapad showed them the real numbers, and the gap between what they had been told and what was true was, in some cases, enormous. One tributary species, the Heth, a quiet and methodical people from a system called Karath 7, filed a formal request for renegotiation of their client status within 6 days of the datapad's contents becoming known. They cited the discrepancy in production reporting as evidence that the terms of their client agreement had been misrepresented. It was a careful and legally precise document, and it landed in the Dominion's administrative system like a very small stone thrown into a very still pond. The third thing was harder to see, but more important than the other 2. People started asking the question out loud. Not in formal settings, not in official meetings, in corridors and side chambers and the private conversations that happen between people who work in the same place and trust each other enough to say what they actually think. The third question Cord had asked, quiet, simple, delivered in a slightly rough human voice at the base of a platform in a throne hall carved from a moon, had attached itself to people's minds the way certain questions do when they are true enough to stick. How long has it been since anyone in this room told you something you didn't want to hear? People who worked in the court knew the answer. They had always known the answer, But knowing something privately is very different from having it said out loud in front of the Queen and the full court and every tributary ambassador on the planet. The question had been asked. It was in the air now. It did not go away. Saravath felt it. She was 10,000 years old, and she had built her empire on the ability to read rooms and people and situations with an accuracy that bordered on instinct. She felt the change in her court the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives, not visible yet, but present, something in the quality of the air. She mobilized a fleet. The order went out on the 5th day. 200 warships directed toward the edge of Dominion space closest to Earth's solar system. The order was clean and formal, and had the full weight of imperial authority behind it. On the 8th day she stood it down. No explanation was given. The fleet returned to its standard patrol positions. Her advisors did not ask why. Asking why was not something her advisors did. On the 12th day, she mobilized a different fleet. On the 15th day, she stood that one down too. Orvith, watching this from his position near the throne, understood something that he had not understood before. He had served Saravath for 300 years, and he had seen her angry and calculating, and cold, and occasionally something that might have been joyful in the distant way that very old beings are sometimes joyful. He had never seen her uncertain. She was uncertain now. And in 10,000 years of empire, uncertainty from the top had always meant something was about to change. On the same 15th day, in a small apartment near a military base in what used to be northern Finland, Elias Cord finished writing his mission report. It was 4 sentences long. He noted that contact had been made, that a data package had been delivered, that no formal agreement had been reached, and that he requested reassignment to border patrol. He submitted it. He made a cup of coffee. He sat by the window and looked at the sky, which was gray and ordinary and very familiar, and he thought about nothing in particular for a while. His dog tag was on the table next to his coffee cup. Outside, the world continued. It did not know yet what had been set in motion. It did not know about the noble houses or the Heth, or the fleet that had been mobilized and stood down twice. It did not know that in a throne hall carved from a moon, a question was still hanging in the air 3 weeks after the man who asked it had walked away. Cord drank his coffee and did not think about any of that. He thought about whether he had enough food in the apartment for the rest of the week, and whether the border patrol posting would be cold, and whether his back would feel better in the morning. It usually did, given enough sleep. He went to bed. The message arrived on a Wednesday. Cord was on border patrol by then, stationed on a small monitoring outpost at the edge of the system, where the war had first started 3 years ago. It was quiet work, long stretches of nothing interrupted by short bursts of routine. He had requested it specifically because it was the kind of posting that gave a person time to think, and he had things he wanted to think about. The message came through official channels, flagged urgent, and it passed through 4 levels of military command before it reached him because nobody at any of those levels was entirely sure what to do with it. It was addressed to Staff Sergeant Elias Cord by name. It came from Velkarath Prime. It requested his presence at a neutral trading station called Heron's Post, located in unclaimed space between human territory and the Dominion border. It was signed by Saravath. His commanding officer called him into her office and asked him if he had any idea what this was about. Cord said he had some idea. She asked him if he was prepared to go. He said yes. She looked at him for a moment with the expression people wore when they were trying to decide if a situation was above their authority or simply unusual, and then she authorized the trip and told him to be careful. He said he would try. Heron's Post was 6 days out. It was a small station, privately owned, politically neutral, the kind of place that existed in the gaps between empires and made its business from the fact that sometimes beings from very different places needed somewhere to meet that belonged to neither of them. It had a docking bay, a bar, a medical facility, and 12 rooms for rent. The walls were old and the lighting was uneven, and it smelled like fuel and recycled air and something fried in oil. Cord arrived on the morning of the 6th day and was shown to a meeting room near the back of the station. The room had a metal table and 4 chairs and a single light overhead and nothing else. It was the least impressive room he had been in since the entire situation started, which he found quietly reassuring. He sat down and waited. Sarevith arrived 20 minutes later. She came without ceremony, no procession, no honor guard. 2 soldiers waited outside the door and that was all. She walked into the room in dark travel clothes rather than her court armor, and without the shadow tech that moved around her in the throne hall she looked different, still tall, still ancient, still carrying the particular weight that 10,000 years of existence puts on a being, but more present somehow, more contained. Like something that usually took up a great deal of space choosing, deliberately, to take up less. She sat down across from him. The table between them was ordinary metal, scratched from use, with a ring on one corner where someone had left a wet cup many times over a long period. It was about as far from a throne carved from a moon as a piece of furniture could get. They looked at each other for a moment. Neither of them spoke first for a little while, which was not uncomfortable the way silences usually are between people who do not know each other well. It was more like the pause at the beginning of something when both parties are deciding how to begin. Sarevith spoke first. "Did you know what those questions would do?" she asked. Her voice was different here too, still precise, still carrying the deep quality that came from 10 millennia of use, but without the performance that had surrounded every word in the throne hall. This was how she spoke when she was not speaking for an audience. Cord considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things without rushing, turning it over once before answering. "No," he said. "I knew they were true. I didn't know how far they'd travel." Sarevith was quiet for a moment. "The Heth have filed for renegotiation," she said. "I've heard. 2 of my noble houses have not spoken directly to each other in 6 weeks. "I didn't plan that part," Cord said. "That was them." "I mobilized 2 fleets," she said. "I know. I stood them both down. I know that too." She looked at him with her gold eyes steady, ancient, carrying something in them now that had not been there in the throne hall. In the throne hall her eyes had been the eyes of someone who had already decided everything. These were the eyes of someone in the middle of deciding something, which was a very different thing and, he thought, probably rarer for her. "Why?" she asked. Not about the fleets. The word was broader than that. She was asking about all of it, the datapad, the questions, the walk, the note at the bottom of the succession section. Cord thought about it. "Because you're going to be our neighbor for a very long time," he said. "And we've had bad neighbors before on a smaller scale and it never ends well for anyone, not even the neighbor." He paused. "And because the honest answer to all 3 of those questions was already in that room, I didn't bring anything new in. I just said it out loud." Sarevith looked at him for a long time. "Your species is irritating," she said. There was no contempt in it this time. It was said the way you describe something that has surprised you into a kind of reluctant respect, flat, honest, slightly tired. "We hear that a lot," Cord said. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one. Old and brief and real. She reached into her travel coat and produced a document. Physical paper, thick, dark, printed in both Velkarath script and English on facing pages. She set it on the scratched metal table between them. He looked at it without picking it up. "Non-aggression," she said. "Trade framework, mutual border recognition, an independent arbitration channel for disputes, no sovereignty conditions on either side." She paused. "Equal terms." Cord looked at the document, then he looked at her. "This is the first time you've offered equal terms to any species," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that he did not expect, delivered in the same even voice she had used for everything else. No drama, no weight added artificially, just the plain shape of the words. "Because you left the room," she said. "Every other species that has ever stood in that hall has stayed. They have begged or argued or collapsed or performed. You turned around and walked away, and you did it without anger and without theater, and I have been thinking about that for 6 weeks, and I cannot find an interpretation of it that I dislike." Cord looked at the document again. He picked up the pen she had placed beside it. He signed his name at the bottom of the English page, the same slightly uneven handwriting he used for everything, the handwriting of a man who took notes on paper because he remembered things better that way. Then he put the pen down. Saravith signed the Velkarath page. They did not shake hands. That was not a Velkarath custom, and Cord did not push it. They simply sat for a moment with the signed document between them on a scratched metal table in a small room on a neutral station that smelled like fuel, and it was enough. Outside the room, the universe continued without knowing what had just happened inside it. 40 star systems continued their slow orbits. Human ships moved along patrol routes. The Heth prepared their renegotiation documents with the careful thoroughness of a people who had been waiting for an opening for a long time. Noble houses sent messages to each other through intermediaries, beginning the slow, careful work of deciding whether to stay angry or find a more useful arrangement. And in a meeting room on Heron's Post, a dark queen who had ruled an empire for 10,000 years stood up from a scratched metal chair and looked at a human soldier who had never been anybody important. And she nodded once. A small nod, not a bow. Just an acknowledgement between two beings who had understood each other well enough to do something that had not been done before. Then she left. Cord sat in the room alone for a few minutes. He looked at the signed document. He thought about the briefings and the escort ship and the 9-day journey and the 6 hours standing on black stone and the walk back through the bones and all of it, the whole strange shape of the thing from beginning to end. Then he folded his copy of the document carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, next to his dog tag. He left the station and boarded the small transport that would take him back to the border outpost. The transport was not a military vessel. It was a civilian commuter shuttle that ran a regular route between 3 stations and happened to stop at Heron's Post on Wednesdays. It had worn seats and bad lighting and a heating system that worked inconsistently. Cord found a seat near the window. He put his jacket over himself like a blanket because the heating was doing its usual poor job. He looked out at the stars for a while, ordinary stars, the kind that are everywhere when you leave a planet, unremarkable and countless and very old. Then he fell asleep. His dog tag was in his fist. His copy of the first equal treaty in Velkarath history was in his pocket. The shuttle carried him quietly through the dark, and outside the window the stars moved slowly past, and somewhere behind him an empire that had never been made to feel small was sitting with that feeling for the first time, and finding, to its own great surprise, that it was not the worst thing that had ever happened to it. And the human species, which had no way of stopping itself and had tried many times and failed, moved forward into another day. The same as it always had. The same as it always would.